Lovely. Whitney, thanks for the thought-provoking presentation. I'm going to pick it up with a strategy question, given we have Michael Porter showing up later this evening. When I look at businesses, business strategy is often about companies being coherent about where to play and how to win. And if I sort of translate that to individual journeys, it translates to where to go and how to grow. And if I sort of overlay that on your framework, it sort of boils down to picking the right S-curve and then growing up the S-curve. So let's talk about picking the right S-curve. Give us a little bit of insight on how should people think about picking the right mountain to climb.
It's a great question. And actually, you just allow me to recap what I just talked about briefly, because once you're at the top of the curve, you say, okay, I've made the decision, it's time to jump, but what do I do? And so this framework gives you an opportunity to kind of check through that. So number one, is this an opportunity for me to play where no one else is playing? Yeah, there might be some competitive risks, but is this playing as much as possible other people are not? Secondly, is it playing to your strengths? Because when you play to your strengths, and in particular distinctive strengths, so for example, if you're a great marketer and you're trying to compete against 19 other marketers, that's a strength, but it's not distinctive. But if you can find a way to be a marketer in a room of 19 coders, now you not only feel strong, it's distinctive, and when you feel strong, you're comfortable playing where other people are not. Third one is you look at your constraints. We think, well, if I could move anywhere in the world, or I could take any kind of job, and it doesn't matter how much money I make. On the one hand, that sounds liberating, but on the other hand, actually, it's quite paralyzing. So if you say, well, I only can live in Mumbai, and I need to make this amount of money, it makes it a lot easier to start narrowing it down. Battling entitlement, I'll just do one more, and then we can talk about the rest. But the idea of battling entitlement, I think, is a really important one. Is whenever you're trying to take on a new job or trying to transition, effectively what you're doing is saying, I want to jump to a new learning curve. But you're also saying to the person who you want to hire you, I want you to jump to a new learning curve. And it's not your learning curve, it's my learning curve. So how do I pack a parachute? How do I translate what I know how to do in a language where it basically de-risks it for them and they say, okay, this isn't scary. All right, I can hire this person. Even though on paper it doesn't quite look perfect, because I packed a parachute by translating what I know how to do into what you need me to do, then you're much more likely to hire me. And so those are a couple of examples of how you can use this framework to transition in your career.
Got it. I guess if I sort of distill what I hear from you, one is about figuring out which S-curve, the other is also about marketing yourself in a meaningful way for the person to hire you. So there's also a marketing job to be done as you think about the next S-curve.
Right.
But again, maybe double-clicking on one of the things you mentioned, market risk versus competitive risk. Just talk about that a little bit, again, in the context of if we talk about individual journeys.
Right.
We all understand what that means in a business context. But give us maybe a couple of examples of what is a market risk and what's a competitive risk when we talk about individual choices.
Yeah, so I think oftentimes inside of an organization, people will say to themselves, you know, I want to do something new, and I think I want his job or her job or his job. And those jobs are already taken, so that's competitive risk. And if you get that job, then that person loses, and maybe they're doing a perfectly fine job. But what if instead you go to your manager and you say, you know, it's time for me to do something new, and I'd like to do those jobs, but I realize they're taken. I see this opportunity over here, and I'll give a quick example, and I shared it this morning, but just a quick example of when I worked on Wall Street. I was at Merrill Lynch, I was in banking, and I got moved into equity research. Basically, I got shoved, actually, speaking of disruption, I was moved into equity research, and they're saying, cover the cement and construction analyst. Well, it turns out that they already had an analyst. So what was I supposed to do? Oh, we have a note. We're being disrupted.
Thank you.
It's a question from the audience. Not really. So I go into equity research, and I'm supposed to cover cement and construction, but they already have an analyst. So now I'm like, well, how do I take on market risk? I don't even have a job. Well, it turns out that there were a number of media companies going public. There's no analyst to cover them. So I said, why don't I cover them? Now, what does this mean? What's great about this is in finding a job for me, I found an opportunity for Merrill Lynch. In finding a place for me to play, I found a place for my company to play. So I took on market risk for myself, but I also kind of took on market risk for Merrill Lynch. And so that's why I go back to this idea that the fundamental unit of disruption is ultimately the individual.
Got it. And maybe just to persist with that theme for a couple of more minutes, and what's the kind of risk that people should not take? Again, if you could sort of maybe double-click on comparative risk, what are the kind of things that you see people do that you would look at it and say, it's doomed for failure from day zero?
Yeah, so I think that it's not necessarily doomed, but the odds are really low. So for example, if I think, there's a job that I want, and I looked on LinkedIn, and I see that there are 50 people applying for that job, I might be more competitive than everybody else. And on the one hand, it feels kind of safe to me to apply for that job because there's a job. It's right there in front of me, there's a job. So that's the whole idea of competitive risk. There's an opportunity, but there's a competition. I might get it, but I might not. In fact, the odds are against me. Instead, if I say, there's this company over here that looks really interesting, or inside of my organization, again, it looks really interesting, and there's this problem that no one's solving, I'm going to come up with a way that I think I can solve that problem. Well, if they decide to create that job, I might not get it, but the odds that I'm going to get it are going way up. Now, again, the reason I tend not to want to do that is because it's hard to want to go play on the playground when no one else is on the playground, and that's what market risk is. So on the one hand, it feels more risky but it's actually less risky when we're willing to take on market risk.
Interesting. Let's start moving on the curve now. I'm curious about the true transition points in that S-curve. Mm-hmm. One is when the curve begins to take off. You call it from inexperience to engagement, when you really start playing to your strengths. And the other is when the curve starts tapering off, which is when boredom or mastery kicks in. So talk to us about what are the lead indicators to look for us to know that we are in that phase of that curve? You're
getting the momentum. Okay, so there are a couple of markers that you can look at. So when you're moving from inexperience, as I mentioned to you, you feel, it's like this jumble of puzzle pieces, right? You don't know how any of those pieces put together, and you come to work every day, and you're like, and this doesn't just, by the way, apply to people at the beginning of the career. This is for all you CEOs too. New CEOs, you're like, I don't quite know how to do this job, and you're not going to admit it to anybody, but let's face it, you all feel that way. You're putting this together, and so you have lots of days where you feel discouraged. Well, the way you know that you're going to start to move into that sweet spot is if you're mapping against the 10,000 hour rule, it's going to be about 6 months. You also might know because last week you felt like you knew what you were doing for 20 hours or 8 hours, and this week it's 16 hours. So that exponential growth is starting to kick in. And you're finding that you're having more and more days where you're feeling competent, and more days where you're feeling confident, and more days where work is fun, and more days where it's hard but not too hard, but still, it's hard but not too hard, and it's still not, it's easier but not too easy, if that makes sense. It's the Goldilocks principle for those of you who like Goldilocks. It's just right. Thank you, Deepak, for summarizing for me.
Sure. And what does the tapering of the curve look like? I guess you spoke about what the liftoff looks like.
Yeah.
What does the tapering of the curve look like?
Yeah, so again, if you're mapping against the 10,000 hour rule and you're not making any changes, right? This doesn't mean that you can't stay in a role for longer than 4 years, but 4 years is a good rule of thumb that once you get to that top, you need to start evaluating. What happens at the top of the curve is that your brain starts chunking. It's like brushing your teeth. You just know how to do it. You get in a car, you put it on automatic. And so if you find yourself kind of dialing it in, saying things like, I've paid my dues, that means you're starting to get bored, and that means you need to do something else. Now, there are a couple of different solutions. One can be that you give yourself, for example, if you're a CEO and you're like, I'm getting kind of bored. Maybe you need to go into a new market. Maybe you need to bring on some new people to mentor. So there are different ways to do it. But at that top, you're feeling like you want to dial it in. You're not as excited. I had one coach who's using this framework say, the CEO said to her, oh, now I know why I'm cranky. I'm cranky because I'm bored. And so that's what it looks like at the top.
Got it. And back to the lift-off, what advice do you have for people to cut their losses? Because sometimes you can get into a new situation, you're quite excited about the S-curve, and then 6 months pass and you realize there's new information, and what you thought it would be and what it is are often quite different.
Yeah.
So how should people think about persisting versus cutting losses?
Okay. So, all right. So if we go back to the number 6 times and 20 times. So 6 times higher means you're going to go from 6% to 36% odds that it's the right curve. So there's still a 64% chance it's the wrong curve. So here's a quick checklist for you. Early on, again, you don't know if it's the right or wrong curve. So if you go through this checklist, then this is a good starting place. Number 1, are you taking the right kinds of risks? Are you playing where no one else is playing? So that may feel wrong, but you know it's just supposed to feel that way. Number 2, are you playing to your strengths, your distinctive strengths? Number 3, which we haven't talked about, is it hard but not debilitating? Meaning, do you show up at work every day and go, this is really hard, but I feel so alive? That's good. Growth is on its way. If instead you find yourself dreading work, you hate Monday morning, you're getting sick. That's happened to me. You get sick when you're on the wrong curve. It's symptoms of a flatlining curve. And then number 4 is, are you gaining momentum, which I said just a minute ago. Is it 4 hours? Is it 8 hours? Is it 16 hours? Then you know that it's the right curve. So if your answers to all those are no, then it's the wrong curve and it's time to cut your losses. Here's the good news. No S-curve is ever wasted. If you really believe that we're always about learning, no S-curve is ever wasted. And if you can say yes, well then just hang in there because the growth, it's going to come.
Got it. Very interesting. It's a bit like Steve Jobs talking about calligraphy in the context of designing the font on the iPhone. So I guess no learning is wasted at some level.
No, it's not.
I want to pick up on one of the things you mentioned, distinctive strengths. Again, in the book, you make the distinction between strengths and distinctive strengths. And again, in a way, it's parallel to the notion of comparative advantage that companies have. So talk to us about what you have in mind when you use the term distinctive strengths.
Yeah, so it's what you do well that other people around you don't. I think one of the things as companies we often don't do is we don't have a good idea of what the strengths of our people, the people on our team are. And let me give you a quick example that I think really can allow you to bring these out a bit. I was talking to an entrepreneur who played basketball in high school, and her coach would have them go out on the court and shoot baskets from every different place on the court and record their percentages. Not unusual, right? But what was unusual is after they recorded the percentages, the coach had them memorize the percentages of everybody else on the team. So they would know what the superpowers are. And so one of the ways that you can use this in your organizations and on your team, and I would encourage you to go back, is have a team meeting and say, okay, Deepak, everybody in the room, what's Deepak's superpowers? And Deepak may not know what his superpowers are, but I guarantee you everybody else on the team does. And then you write those superpowers down. And then the next time you've got a project or a contract that you're going after, and you're trying to decide, should we take this on or not? One of the criterion that you should be using is, does this contract leverage the strengths of my 10 people on the team? Why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you leverage those strengths? So that's a way of you're not only playing to your strengths, you're leveraging your distinctive strengths, and you're really allowing them to be a part of the strategy of your business, not just sort of this nice thing, what are my strengths?
And you alluded to this point about feedback from the team, and in the book, I found the term speedback.
Yes.
Quite interesting. Again, I'd urge you to spend a couple of minutes sharing with the audience what the term actually means.
Yeah,
it comes from Google, doesn't it?
Yeah, it comes from Google. It's really interesting. The premise is that, we talk about speed dating and, you sit down for 2 minutes and decide, if you want to date some more. Well, this is basically the premise of I can sit down with one of you and we can sit down for like 5 minutes and talk to each other. And then after that 5 minutes, I can say to you, can you give me some feedback about me and what you think I do well? And then vice versa. And we think that we can't, but the reality is that we contain so much information just in sort of the presence of who we are that we give off a lot of information, and that person who barely knows us can pick up on that and give us a lot of information about what our strengths actually are.
It's very
fascinating, right?
Absolutely, and if I sort of marry that to where the world of performance management and leadership development is going, even there was a recent McKinsey quarterly article which basically said that this notion of performance management every 6 months or 12 months is just too late.
Oh.
It just needs to be much faster. The feedback loops need to be much faster. So speedback was an interesting learning for me personally. Let me move to hiring. I used to be a recruitment consultant at Egon Zehnder in my previous life.
You mean a headhunter?
Headhunter, okay, as some people call it. One of the themes you talk about is hiring for potential, especially if you're a leader trying to manage a portfolio of S-curves in your team. Don't hire for capability or expertise, but hire for people who are at the bottom of the S-curve. So talk to us about what leaders should look for when they are hiring for potential.
Yeah, so they've got to have some basic skills, right? But I think that so often when we're hiring, the hiring is a little bit of a vanity exercise of we want a person with an MBA from this school, and then we will feel important because we hired this person from that school. And hiring for potential is, what are the minimum requirements that I need from this person from a skill set perspective? What are the minimum requirements? And then beyond that, is this a person who knows how to learn? Is this a person who is hungry? Is this a person who can play on a team, play nicely on a team? So you hire for those basic skills and then look for the skills of a person who knows how to learn. And then what happens is, if you hire at the low end of the curve, because they've got 3 or 4 years to learn, you've got 4 years with this person as opposed to a person at the top of the curve who in 6 months is going to be bored. And now what do you do with them? You're not going to fire them, but then they're not productive. And so if you're hiring for potential, look at the basic requirements, find a person who's willing to learn, then you're going to be able to hire much better, hire people who innovate, hire people who are asking questions, and it allows your organization to be much more innovative as opposed to complacent, bored at the top of the curve.
And if I may persist with that, could you talk a little bit about how the hiring is different when you hire for potential versus when you hire for experience, right from how you write a job description? I remember you had some insights around how they should be worded differently, but also the interviewing process. How does the process or the kind of questioning or inquiry you run differ when you hire for potential versus when you hire for experience?
Yeah, so I think so on the job descriptions, I think we kind of just talked about that, of just looking at the basic requirements as opposed to, there are some jobs, for example, we say we need an MBA, but the fact is they may not even need a college degree, really. And there are lots of ways now to credential people without having to have them have a college degree. So I think that's the first thing. The second way, and you can find out a lot in the interview process, is this a person who comes in and asks you questions? There's a wonderful example of this, of a woman who is now the CIO at the National Football League in the United States. And she saw a job description that looked interesting, and they were hiring for a VP of IT. And when she read the description, she looked at it. She was picking her fantasy football team. She reads the description, and she looks at it, and she said, they don't need a VP of IT. They need a CIO. So she goes in for the job description, and she says, I'm interviewing for this, but when I look at all the jobs or the functions that you actually need to fill, you need a CIO. So part of, I think, hiring for potential, not for proficiency, is a person who's coming in and clearly very interested, engaged, asking questions, trying to figure out what that might look like and what you really need. So you're almost co-creating that job together. And then the other thing I would say, and you didn't ask this, but I think it's important, is sometimes when we hire, we use the same job description that we used 4 years ago, when over time things have really evolved and there are people on your team who are actually already playing that role. And so if you hire someone to do that same role, you created competitive risk on your team and disincentivize them. So really rethink what your description is.
Very interesting. And the other thing I wanted to sort of maybe briefly mention is you also say that when you hire for potential, there's a greater chance of having more women in the leadership team, and there's a greater opportunity for diversity, at least from a gender perspective. So maybe if you could expand on that a little bit.
Okay, I will, and then we have to wrap up.
Sure.
You're telling us time's up.
So we have, the note I got was we have 10 more minutes.
Oh, okay. So here's what's really interesting. There's research that's been done that says that men are judged on their potential, and women are judged on their track record, number one. So we're more likely to hire a man who doesn't have the skills because we think he's got the potential. And we'll look at a woman and say, she's never done that before, can't hire her. So that's one piece. The second piece is that what they found is that if a man doesn't know how to do the job, he'll be like, I can learn it, I'll figure it out. And a woman won't actually apply for a job unless she can do 100% of the job requirements. So what that means is, frequently when you hire a woman, she's probably further up the S curve than you think she is. And it means that when you hire a man, he might be further down the S curve than you think he is. And so you can obviously calibrate for that, but it's really interesting to know that. And so when you're willing to be a little bit more minimalist in your job requirements, you're probably going to get more women who are willing to apply.
Got it. The other piece I wanted to talk about, Whitney, was when you're at the top of an S curve, let's say you need to come back to the foothills to climb another S curve. At the same time, people want to climb vertically in an organization. So what's the tension there? How do you see people deal with that trade-off sometimes that they have to make where they need to sacrifice a little bit of career progression in the spirit of jumping multiple S curves? So how does that play out in a corporate context?
Yeah, well, I think the way it plays out is that there has to be, well, there doesn't have to be, but it's going to be a lot easier if the leadership makes that possible. And so, and also, I think sometimes people actually are willing to make moves, but we haven't asked them. So we just assume that people want to climb up. And sometimes people are thinking, you know what, I want to just try something new. I don't necessarily need to climb, and I might even be willing to take a little bit of a cut in pay if I can do something different. The thing that we need to be thinking about is when we're crafting these steps back is, will it be a slingshot? So it's not a step back or sideways just because. You know, if you're thinking about this from a math perspective, the reason disruption works is, right now, let me just do this. You've got right now here's the slope of your current curve, right? This is your trajectory. When you disrupt yourself, what do? You go down the y-axis. That's why everybody thinks you're out of your mind. Because why would you purposely go from here on the y-axis to here? But the reason you do it is because you believe that the slope of your line is going to be steeper. That's why it's a slingshot. That's why you're willing to disrupt yourself. And so inside of an organization, if you start to have that mindset, then people are willing to do that. Now, I'm going to answer that question, or finish answering that question by saying, I can't control, you can't control what the people above you do. You can't control it. But you can control what you do on your own watch. And so if you make it possible for the people on your watch to move around, and you might be thinking, well, I can't do that because if I try to move someone somewhere else, they'll think I'm trying to get rid of them. I think they're damaged goods because, you know, people don't do laterals and people don't move, and if they're really that talented, I would want to hold on to them. So here's my advice to you. When you have a star performer that you want to give the opportunity to grow and you're willing to advocate for them to move, say to the person, money back guarantee. Money back guarantee. You take this person for 6 months and you don't like them, I'm telling you they are so good I will take them back. But trust me, you're going to love them. And then what happens? Bottom of the curve, they're engaged, they innovate, they're happy, the company's happy, and now you've opened the door for someone underneath them to start to move into their sweet spot. So it's complicated, it's not easy, but it can start with you and your team.
Got it. I just want to do a time check. Is Amit around? Do we have another 10 minutes?
I think we should, no, let's wrap up. Let's do one more question and wrap.
He said 6:45, okay.
But they want dinner.
Sure. let's talk about our organizations. We've spoken about individuals, and I think you alluded to what it takes to make this possible. What's the implication for leadership? Again, for the CEOs in the room, what's the mindset shift required for them to start running organizations with this sort of a paradigm?
Well, first of all, I would say to realize that you yourself are on a learning curve. I think that's really, really important, is to recognize that, okay, maybe I've been in this role for 5 years and maybe I'm getting a little bit bored. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to quit or step down as CEO. One of the most innovative companies I know of in terms of practicing personal disruption is WD-40, and the CEO has been there for 20 years, but they've done things like go into China, and so they've found ways to jump to new learning curves. Another way that you can do it in a more synthetic fashion if you're a CEO, and again, people will follow your lead, is to do something like a drive-by, to be willing to say, all right, I'm a car manufacturer, I'm an automobile manufacturer, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go for a day and I'm going to work on the floor. I don't want people to know who I am because then they'll treat me really nicely, and that's not what I want. I want to have the experience of being on the floor of the plant, and what is that like? And so that's an opportunity for you to go to the bottom of a learning curve. I think the other way that you can start to set that trend is, actually, I'm going to tell a quick story. Is that okay?
Sure.
All right. Some of you have heard this, but I think it's such a good story, and I think it's really illustrative of what I'm talking about. There was a fellow working at a company called LinkedIn. He was a VP. He was running $1 billion unit of business, so one of 25, 6,000 people. So he's quite senior. And he had started early on. He had gone in sales from $10 million and 8 people, and now he's at $1 billion and 1,000 people. He goes to the CEO, he's having this walking meeting, celebrate, victory lap, and says, you know, someday I really want to be a tech company CEO. Thinking, of course, he's going to say yes. And the CEO says, you know what? You're in sales. You've been in sales, and you need to know how to build product, and so you can't get to be a CEO from here. So the guy is completely devastated. He thinks, I don't get to have my dream. So he goes back, he thinks, he has, reflects, and he's like, what should I do? And after he goes back and he says, okay, let's make great product. What? Like, seriously, you're going to go from $1 billion, 1,000 reports to, what is it? Individual contributor, 4 direct reports, no guarantees. Can you imagine? Well, guess what? The CEO said yes. The CEO let this incredible high performer jump to the bottom of a new curve in product where he had 4 direct reports. Well, 5 years later, he's now the head of another division. It's a $2 billion division. He has sales and product reporting to him. The step back was a huge slingshot forward for him and for LinkedIn. So what can CEOs do? They can make it possible for people to practice personal disruption. If you have people on your team who are high performers and high potentials, if they want to try something new, let them. You know, Alan Mulally, former CEO of Ford, do you know what he says? When you're the CEO, your face isn't yours anymore. Everything you do is micro, not micromanaged, but it's analyzed in detail. If you do just 1 or 2 of these high profiles, let people disrupt, you'll start to see some movement. And when you start to see that movement, you're going to see more innovation. And then you will be able to disrupt rather than be disrupted.
Got it. Thank you. Just want to do a quick time check because the monitor here says time up, but I just want to can we wrap up?
We have another 5 minutes more.
All right. Should we open it to the audience
let's
for a
ask
couple of questions?
Yeah.
Can we have a couple of questions from the audience?
Okay, good.
Are there mics here doing the rounds?
Hi, my name is Ajay Nanavati. I've just moved back to India after 30 years with 3M in St. Paul. You know, one of the comments what I observed was this whole question, both on a personal front as well as on the corporate front, there's this huge danger that we surround ourselves with clones of ourselves.
Yes.
You know, and I think this is, the number one challenge, and I see that even on your personal social spectrum, as well as on the corporate spectrum. And even on board levels, you tend to have boards who are all clones of yourself. So, and I guess it flows from a sort of a comfort factor. Do you have any suggestions on how you sort of break that paradigm of not surrounding yourself with clones?
Yeah, such a great point. It's so funny that you say that, because one of the things I talk about in the book Build an A-Team is that whenever you hire a person, you need to look at the functional reasons why you're hiring them, what jobs you want them to do, but you also have to look at the emotional reasons why you're hiring that person. And oftentimes the emotional reason is, I want a clone. I want to hire more of me, a shinier, sleeker version of me. And so I think that once we're aware of that, then we'll start to say, okay, I know my tendency is want to hire someone like me, but I need to understand that that's not a good and emotional job for them to be doing. There are functional jobs I need them to do, and probably trying to be like me isn't the right emotional job. And the more we're aware of that, the less we'll do it. All right. Done? Okay.
Thank you, Whitney.
All right. I'll talk to you later. Okay? Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.